Most K-pop groups get a debut date, a concept, and a set of rules. Stray Kids got something different. JYP Entertainment, one of the big four labels in the Korean music industry, handed this group a level of creative and operational autonomy that almost no idol group in the history of K-pop has received at the same stage of their career. And we're not talking about vague statements from press releases. We're talking about documented, observable, verifiable decisions, things you can trace through contracts, production credits, broadcast records, and public statements from both the company and the members themselves. Why would a major label take that kind of risk with a group that hadn't even proven itself commercially? What exactly did JYP put on the table that other companies wouldn't? And more importantly, how did each individual member actually benefit from it in ways that changed their careers, their creative identities, and their place in the global music industry? 8 members, 8 stories, one label that decided to do things differently. Number 8. The Protected Return. Hyunjin. To understand what JYP gave Hyunjin, you first need to understand what the Korean entertainment industry typically does when a controversy hits one of its artists. Because the pattern is consistent and it is not pretty. When allegations surface against an idol, the standard playbook involves swift distancing, sometimes a quiet contract termination, and in most cases, the artist never recovers their previous standing within the company. That is not an assumption, that is the documented outcome for dozens of Korean celebrities who faced public backlash during the peak years of social media accountability culture in the early 2020s. Hwang Hyunjin, born September 20, 2000 in Seoul, South Korea, is one of the few cases where the company chose a fundamentally different path, and the decision JYP made during the most dangerous moment of Hyunjin's career ended up shaping not just his future, but the entire scope of what Stray Kids could become as a creative brand. In March 2021, allegations of school bullying were posted against Hyunjin on an online community platform. This was during a period when similar allegations were surfacing against multiple K-pop idols simultaneously, and the public reaction in South Korea was severe. Several other idols from different companies had their contracts terminated or their groups disbanded as a direct result of comparable situations during that same window. JYP Entertainment released an official statement acknowledging the situation. Hyunjin himself issued a public apology. And then JYP did something that was not the industry default. They put him on an official hiatus, maintained his contract, maintained his position within Stray Kids, and let the situation settle without cutting him loose. He went on hiatus in March 2021 and returned to official activities in May 2021. That is roughly 2 months, not a permanent removal, not a quiet dismissal. A structured pause followed by a deliberate, supported reintegration. Now, the cynical reading of this is that JYP was protecting a commercial asset. That is fair. But what happened after the return is where the story becomes genuinely significant, because JYP did not simply reinsert Hyunjin into the group's schedule and move on. They made a series of intentional decisions that actively expanded what Hyunjin was allowed to do within his role as an idol. And those decisions went well beyond anything the standard K-pop idol contract structure typically accommodates. Hyunjin is a trained dancer. He began studying classical and contemporary dance from a young age before becoming a JYP trainee. He was selected through the 2017 Mnet reality program that formed Stray Kids, and he has served as one of the group's main dancers and visual representatives since their debut in March 2018. That part of his role is conventional. What is not conventional is that JYP began formally supporting and platforming Hyunjin's identity as a visual artist, specifically as a painter, as a legitimate professional dimension of his work within the group. Hyunjin's interest in fine arts and painting had been visible to fans through social media for years, but after his return from hiatus in 2021, the way the company treated that interest changed. His artwork began appearing in official Stray Kids content. His visual sensibility, which spans detailed illustrative work and expressive painting styles, became something the label leaned into rather than treated as a private hobby that needed to be managed or kept separate from his idol persona. This matters because in the K-pop industry, an idol's public identity is typically highly controlled and compartmentalized. The idea that a member's independent artistic practice could be integrated into the group's official brand identity, promoted through the label's own channels, and used as a genuine component of that member's professional profile is not standard. It requires deliberate institutional support, and JYP provided it. The commercial dimension of this became visible in 2023 when Hyunjin was announced as a global brand ambassador for Versace, the Italian luxury fashion house founded in Milan in 1978. This was not a local endorsement deal or a regional campaign. This was Versace, one of the most recognized luxury fashion names in the world, choosing Hyunjin as a face of the brand at a global level. Luxury fashion houses at that tier are extraordinarily selective about their ambassador choices. They are not making those decisions based on an idol's fanbase alone. They are looking at image, creative identity, and cultural fit. The fact that Hyunjin had been allowed by JYP to cultivate a documented, visible identity as a visual artist, someone whose aesthetic sensibility extended beyond performance into fine arts and fashion, almost certainly contributed to his appeal as a candidate for that kind of partnership. JYP's decision to give him the space to develop that identity publicly was, in part, what made him legible to a brand like Versace as something more than an idol. There is also the matter of his role in Stray Kids' visual identity more broadly. Hyunjin has been involved in the conceptual and visual direction of the group's presentations in ways that go beyond what most idol members at comparable career stages participate in. His influence is visible in the group's aesthetic choices, in the way certain performances are framed, and in the visual language of content that the group puts out. JYP giving him the latitude to exercise that influence rather than confining his role strictly to dancing and being present on screen reflects a management approach that saw his specific abilities as something to develop and deploy strategically, not just as a member function to be slotted into a pre-existing template. What makes Hyunjin's case particularly instructive is the timeline. The privilege JYP extended to him is not just what they gave him before he became a major commercial figure, it's what they gave him in the immediate aftermath of the worst public moment of his career, when the easiest business decision would have been to cut losses and restructure. Instead, they held the position, supported the return, and then actively invested in building a fuller professional identity around him, one that eventually landed him partnerships with global luxury brands and a creative scope that very few K-pop idols operating in the same industry ever get to access. The K-pop industry is full of stories about what companies take away from their artists under pressure. Hyunjin's story is about what JYP chose to protect and what they built on top of that decision. Number 7. The fastest path to debut, Felix. The K-pop trainee system is not subtle about what it demands. To understand what JYP gave Lee Felix, you need to understand what the standard trainee experience actually looks like, because the gap between what most trainees go through and what Felix experienced is wide enough to tell you something very specific about how JYP read him from the beginning. In the Korean music industry, the average trainee period before debut ranges from 2 to 7 years. That is not an exaggeration pulled from a fan forum. It is consistent across documented accounts from artists who have been through the system at multiple major labels. Trainees practice vocal technique, performance choreography, language proficiency, physical conditioning, sometimes for years, before a company decides they are ready to put in front of a camera or an audience. Some trainees go through that entire process and never debut at all. Lee Felix, born September 15, 2000, in Sydney, Australia, went through approximately 6 months of training before JYP placed him in the lineup for what would become Stray Kids. 6 months. In an industry where multi-year preparation is the standard, that number is not just unusual, it is among the shortest trainee-to-debut trajectories that any member of a major K-pop group from a Big Four label has ever had. Felix is Korean-Australian. His family background is Korean, but he was born and raised in Sydney, which means that when he entered JYP's training program, he was navigating a new country, a professional performance environment, and the full weight of what it means to be selected for a debut group at one of the most competitive entertainment companies in South Korea, all simultaneously. The pressure that creates is not theoretical. Multiple idols across the industry have spoken publicly about the psychological difficulty of the trainee period, even when they have years to adjust. Felix was given months, and the fact that JYP made that call, that they looked at a teenager from Sydney who had been in the building for half a year and decided he was ready to be put on a nationally broadcast Mnet reality program in front of Korean audiences, is itself a significant institutional decision. It communicates something about what JYP saw in him that overrode the conventional preparation timeline. The Mnet reality program Stray Kids aired in 2017. It was the mechanism through which JYP selected the final lineup for the group. Trainees competed and were evaluated over the course of the show, with eliminations determining who made the final debut roster. Felix made it through. He debuted with Stray Kids in March 2018. From that point, the decisions JYP made about how to position Felix within the group's identity began to become visible, and they follow a consistent logic. Take what is specific and distinctive about him and make it central rather than peripheral. The most immediately identifiable example of this is his voice. Felix has a vocal texture that is genuinely unusual in the K-pop context, a deep, low, gravelly tone that sits well below the typical register of idol group vocalists. K-pop vocal aesthetics have historically trended toward brighter, higher tones, particularly for male idols. Felix's voice sits entirely outside that convention. A different company, working with a different framework, might have treated that as a technical limitation to be worked around, something to minimize in production, to keep in the background, to avoid featuring prominently in the group's sonic output. JYP's production approach, which operates in close collaboration with the members themselves through 3RACHA, made it the opposite choice. Felix's voice is used as a deliberate sonic anchor in Stray Kids' music. His deep tone appears at strategic moments in productions, in opening lines, in pre-chorus drops, in sections where the contrast between his register and the other members' voices creates a textural effect that became part of the group's recognizable sound. It was not buried, it was built into the architecture of the music. The same logic applies to his international identity. Felix, being Australian, being fluently bilingual in English and Korean, and carrying a cultural background that is distinct from the rest of the groups, none of that was treated by JYP as a complication to manage. It was treated as an asset to leverage. In a group that was being positioned from very early in their career as a globally oriented act rather than a domestically focused one, having a member who could communicate naturally and fluently with English-speaking audiences, who understood Western pop culture from the inside rather than as an external reference, and who visually and culturally represented the kind of international diversity that global audiences increasingly recognize and respond to, that is not a small thing. Felix functions as a genuine bridge between Stray Kids and international fanbases in a way that is not performed or forced. It comes from who he actually is, and JYP's decision to position him that way rather than push him toward a more standardized Korean idol presentation is a documented choice with documented commercial outcomes. Those outcomes became visible at a significant scale in November 2023 when Felix was announced as a global ambassador for Louis Vuitton. Louis Vuitton is not making global ambassador selections casually. The brand, founded in Paris in 1854, is among the most valuable luxury fashion houses in the world by brand valuation, and the criteria for global ambassador selection at that level involve image alignment, audience reach, and cultural positioning across multiple markets simultaneously. Felix's selection was not just about his fanbase, though his fanbase is substantial. It reflected the specific identity that had been built around him: internationally legible, visually distinctive, culturally fluid, which is exactly the profile that a global luxury brand needs in an ambassador who is meant to move across markets. JYP's decision to develop and platform that identity, rather than flatten it into a more conventional idol template, was a prerequisite for Felix being in that conversation at all. There is one more dimension of what JYP gave Felix that doesn't get discussed in proportion to its significance: the decision to keep him in the group through the early period when the international member dynamic could easily have created internal pressure or external pressure. Building a cohesive group identity that includes someone with a genuinely different cultural background and a training period that was a fraction of what other members went through requires institutional commitment to that decision. JYP made that commitment and sustained it. Felix's presence in Stray Kids was not an experiment that the company was willing to abandon. It was a structural choice, and the way that choice has compounded over time in terms of the group's global reach, their brand partnerships, their cultural residence in markets outside Korea, is part of the return on that early investment. 6 months from walking into JYP to standing in a debut lineup, the industry standard is years. That gap tells you exactly what JYP decided Felix was worth from almost the first moment they saw him. Number 6. The reversal no one expected. Lee No. There's a specific kind of institutional courage that it takes to publicly contradict your own production. When a company runs a broadcast reality competition with elimination rounds, when those eliminations air on national television in front of a live audience and a viewership that has been following the process, the expectation, both from the industry and from the public, is that the outcome of that competition is the outcome. The show produces the result, the company follows the result, the group debuts with whoever survived the eliminations. That is the understood structure. Lee No is the reason JYP Entertainment decided that structure was less important than getting the right people into the room. Lee Min-ho, born October 25, 2009 in Gimpo, Gyeonggi-do, South Korea, was eliminated from the Mnet reality program Stray Kids during the show's broadcast run in 2017. JYP put him in the debut lineup anyway. That decision to override a publicly broadcast elimination and include a member who had been cut on camera is one of the most concrete and specific privileges any K-pop company has ever extended to an individual artist, and understanding why JYP made that call requires going back further than the reality show itself. Before Lee No was a JYP trainee, he was already performing. In 2016, he worked as a backup dancer on broadcast stages, including performances connected to major acts in the Korean music industry. The fact that he was working professional performance stages before he was signed to any label is significant. It means that when he entered JYP's training program, he was not a raw talent being built from scratch. He was someone who already understood the physical and professional demands of live performance, who had developed his technical ability in real conditions rather than exclusively in a practice room. That background shaped the level of polish he brought to the Stray Kids reality show, and it also shaped what JYP's internal evaluation of him looked like, because the people making decisions about that group's final roster had access to information that television audiences did not. They saw his training sessions, his consistency, his full performance range outside the edited narrative of a broadcast competition. What the show's elimination reflected was the logic of broadcast entertainment. What JYP's reversal reflected was the logic of actually building a group that could perform at the highest level for years. When JYP made the decision to include Lee No in the debut lineup, despite his on-screen elimination, the company was doing something that goes against a core principle of the reality competition format, which is that viewer engagement and public investment in the outcome are treated as the primary variables. Overriding that outcome carries risk. It can alienate the audience that invested emotionally in the competition's result. It can read as a company simply ignoring the public and doing whatever it wanted anyway. JYP absorbed that risk because their internal assessment of Lee No's value to the group was higher than the broadcast result. That is a strong institutional statement about how they read him, and it set up the terms under which he would go on to operate within Stray Kids, as someone the company had already demonstrated it would go out of its way to protect and retain. Lee No is one of the main dancers of Stray Kids, and the way JYP has allowed him to function within the group's performance identity reflects a consistent pattern of giving him creative latitude that most idol group members at comparable career stages do not have access to. His movement style is recognizably his own, sharp, precise, and with a control over isolations and transitions that comes from years of developed technical practice. JYP's choreographic and creative direction for Stray Kids has, over the group's career, consistently incorporated performance concepts that play to the individual strengths of the group's dancers, rather than flattening everyone into the same functional role. Lee No's distinct style is visible within group performances in ways that are deliberate, not accidental, and that reflects production decisions made at the label level about how to showcase the group's technical range. Beyond performance, JYP has given Lee No something that sounds relatively minor until you look at its actual commercial and cultural impact: the freedom to make his personal life, specifically his 3 cats, a central and fully supported element of his public identity. His cats, Dory, Suni, and Dungi, have been featured in official content, in live streams, in promotional material, and in fan-facing interactions to a degree that is genuinely unusual for the K-pop industry, where artists' personal lives are typically managed with significant caution and kept at a deliberate distance from their professional brand. The 3 cats have accumulated their own fanbase. Content featuring them generates engagement numbers that are serious by any platform's metrics. They have become, functionally, a part of the Stray Kids content ecosystem, not because Lee No snuck personal content past a restrictive company, but because JYP recognized that the authentic, specific, personal character he brings through those interactions is precisely what builds the kind of parasocial connection with audiences that sustains long-term fandom. Allowing an artist to be genuinely themselves in a visible, public-facing way that includes their home life and personal attachments requires a company to make a deliberate decision to trust that artist's instincts about what their audience responds to. JYP made that decision with Lee No. The combination of these privileges, being reinstated after a public elimination, being given creative latitude in performance, and being allowed to incorporate a fully personal and specific identity into his public-facing presence, reflects a through line in how JYP has managed Lee No from the beginning. The company has consistently made choices that prioritize keeping what is real and specific about him intact, rather than standardizing him into a more generically manageable idol profile. That approach required an initial act of institutional conviction that happened before a single album was released, before a single commercial result validated anything, when JYP looked at the output of their own broadcast competition, decided it was wrong about Lee No, and simply reversed it. In an industry where the standard operating procedure is to treat competition results as final and contractual, that reversal is not a minor footnote. It is the founding fact of everything Lee No has been able to do since then. The company told him, through an action rather than a statement, that they believed he belonged in the room even when the official process said he did not. Every performance he has delivered since March 2018 has been built on top of that single decision JYP made when the cameras were still rolling and the elimination had already aired. Not every second chance in the K-pop industry gets that kind of institutional backing. Lee No's did. Number 4. The underground voice JYP didn't silence. Changbin. There is a specific tension that exists in every major K-pop label between the company's need to control its artists' output and an individual artist's drive to create and release on their own terms. That tension usually resolves in one direction. The company controls the output. Music does not get released without label approval. Artists do not build independent public profiles before the company has structured and sanctioned the debut. The timeline, the platform, the concept, the content, all of it flows through the company's production and marketing architecture. That is not a cynical characterization. It is simply how the business model of major K-pop labels has operated consistently across the industry. Say Changbin, born August 11, 1999 in Yongin, Gyeonggi-do, South Korea, is one of the very few trainees in JYP Entertainment's history who was given explicit permission to operate outside that architecture before he had ever officially debuted. And the platform on which he did it was not a controlled, company-managed environment. It was SoundCloud, a public streaming platform accessible to anyone with an internet connection, where the music he released lived entirely outside the promotional machinery of one of South Korea's biggest entertainment companies. JYP said yes to that. Understanding why that yes matters requires understanding what Changbin brought to the room before the company ever put him on a stage. Changbin's musical identity before joining JYP's training program was rooted in underground rap culture. In South Korea, the underground rap scene operates distinctly from the idol music industry. It prioritizes technical skill, lyrical density, and creative autonomy over the polished, synchronized performance aesthetic of mainstream K-pop. Artists in that scene develop their craft without the commercial framework of a major label, and the sensibility they build there is different in texture and intent from what gets produced inside the idol system. Changbin carried that sensibility into JYP's training program, and the question of what would happen to it inside a major label structure was a legitimate one. Would the company file it down to make it fit the group's commercial requirements? Would his underground rap inclinations be treated as raw material to be refined into something more conventionally palatable? JYP's answer, in practical terms, was neither of those options. The answer was 3 Russia. In 2017, JYP sanctioned the formation of a production subunit consisting of 3 Stray Kids members: Bangchan, who operates under the name CB97, Changbin, who operates under the name Spear B, and Han, who operates under the name J1. This unit, 3 Russia, was given the freedom to compose, produce, and release original music independently, not through JYP's official release channels, not as a managed promotional campaign for an upcoming debut, but through SoundCloud as a self-directed creative project. The music they released on SoundCloud in 2017 and into the period surrounding the group's March 2018 debut exists as a documented, publicly accessible body of work. It includes original compositions written and produced by the members themselves, covering lyrical content and sonic territory that reflects their actual creative instincts rather than a company-assigned concept. For Changbin specifically, the SoundCloud releases gave him something that almost no K-pop idol at a comparable stage in their career has: a public musical identity that he built on his own terms, on an open platform, before his official debut, with his company's knowledge and approval. The significance of JYP approving this cannot be overstated in the context of how K-pop labels typically manage pre-debut output. A major entertainment company sanctioning its trainees to release independent music on a public platform before debut means accepting that the public will form impressions of those artists before the company has the chance to frame them. It means accepting that the content might not align with the polished, carefully produced image that debut campaigns are typically designed to establish. It means trusting that the artist's independent creative output will reflect well enough on them and on the company that the benefits of that authenticity outweigh the risks of uncontrolled public exposure. JYP made that calculation and decided it worked in Changbin's favor and in the group's favor. because what Changbin was creating independently was genuinely strong enough to stand on its own. Changbin's technical ability as a rapper is a matter of documented public record. His delivery speed, the rate at which he executes syllables in rapid-fire rap sections, has been noted and discussed extensively in K-pop media and fan communities, and it sits at the upper range of what is technically achievable in the genre. This is not a marketing claim. It is an observable feature of his recorded and live performances that anyone can verify by listening. His lyric writing, which draws on the underground rap tradition of dense, internally rhyming Korean wordplay, operates at a level of complexity that is distinct from the average idol group rapper profile. JYP recognized that this specific, developed, technical skill set was not something to dilute in order to make it fit a more commercially accessible mold. The production approach that Stray Kids' music has taken across their discography consistently deploys Changbin's rap ability at full intensity, the speed, the density, the lyrical weight, rather than pulling it back to a more radio-friendly register. This has direct commercial consequences. One of the things that distinguishes Stray Kids' music from a significant portion of K-pop output is its sonic aggression and technical complexity, and Changbin's contribution to that identity is substantial. Songs that feature his full technical range in prominent positions draw a specific kind of listener, one who is engaged by the craft itself, who tracks lyrics closely, who responds to technical execution as a value in its own right. That listener profile builds deep, durable fandom rather than casual streaming numbers, and it extends the group's reach into music communities that would not typically engage with K-pop at all. JYP's decision to let Changbin operate at full capacity rather than modulate him for broader accessibility is a commercial decision as much as it is a creative one. And the foundation of that decision was laid during the Three Russia SoundCloud period, when the company looked at what Changbin was creating independently and decided it was worth keeping intact. What JYP gave Changbin is difficult to quantify in the way that a brand ambassadorship or a reinstated debut position can be pointed to as a concrete event. What they gave him was something more structural, the right to bring his full creative identity into a major label framework without being asked to leave the significant parts of it at the door. The underground rap sensibility, the technical depth, the drive to produce and release on his own terms, none of that was treated as a liability to be managed. It was treated as an asset to be deployed. And the fact that the first place JYP deployed it was on an independent public platform before a single official album had been released, before the group had a fan base to speak of, tells you exactly how confident the company was when they looked at, say, Changbin. The underground rarely survives contact with the major label system. In Changbin's case, it did, because JYP built the architecture for it to survive from the very beginning.
Number 3. The mind they chose to protect. Han. The Korean entertainment industry has a well-documented problem with how it handles artists' mental health. The schedules are punishing, the public scrutiny is relentless, and the structural expectation within most labels is that artists perform through whatever personal difficulties they are experiencing, because the commercial calendar does not pause for internal struggles. This is not an abstract critique. It is a pattern that has been visible in public reporting, in artists' own retrospective accounts, and in several high-profile cases across the industry that ended in ways that cannot be undone. Han Ji-sung, born September 14, 2000, in Incheon, South Korea, who grew up partly in Malaysia and Australia before returning to Korea to pursue music, is one of the artists who experienced firsthand what it looks like when a major K-pop label decides to treat mental health as a legitimate professional consideration rather than a scheduling inconvenience. What JYP gave Han is not the most visible privilege on this list in terms of external markers like brand partnerships, or broadcast decisions. It is arguably the most significant one because it is the one that was about keeping a person functional rather than keeping a brand operational. And the fact that those two things aligned in JYP's management of Han says something specific about the company's approach that the rest of the K-pop industry has been slow to match. Han is part of 3 Racha, alongside Bangchan and Changbin, operating under the stage name J1. His role within that unit and within Stray Kids' broader production structure is not limited to performing what others create. He has songwriting and production credits across a substantial portion of Stray Kids' discography, a body of work that, when examined track by track, reveals a creative output that is unusually high in volume and unusually personal in content for an idol group member at any major label. The lyrics Han writes frequently address anxiety, self-doubt, the weight of expectations, emotional exhaustion, and the specific psychological texture of being a young person under enormous professional pressure. These are not abstract themes deployed because they test well with focus groups. They are specific, detailed, and consistent across years of output, which is what makes them credible as genuine personal expression rather than calculated branding. JYP allowing that content to be the actual content of Stray Kids' music, without sanitizing it into something more generically uplifting or commercially safe, is itself a form of institutional trust that most labels do not extend. The context for understanding Han's childhood matters here. His family relocated from South Korea to Malaysia when he was young, and he subsequently spent time in Australia before returning to Korea to pursue his ambition of becoming a music artist. That means Han, like Felix and Bangchan, navigated significant cultural displacement during a formative period, moving between countries, adjusting to different languages and social environments, and then choosing to re-enter Korean society specifically to subject himself to one of the most demanding professional preparation systems in the entertainment world. The psychological complexity of that trajectory is real, and it is the kind of lived experience that produces either profound creative depth or significant personal difficulty, and in Han's case, clearly both. JYP took on a trainee who was carrying that kind of layered background and made the decision to let that complexity feed the music rather than smooth it out of the professional presentation. In 2022, that decision was tested in a direct and observable way. During the period surrounding Stray Kids activities, Han stepped back from certain schedules due to health concerns. JYP Entertainment made an official acknowledgement of the situation, and the group continued activities while Han recovered. He returned to full participation after the hiatus period. The mechanics of this, a member stepping back, a company supporting that decision publicly, a group continuing without all members present until the member returned, are worth examining against the industry standard, which in most cases does not accommodate individual health needs at the cost of group scheduling. The implicit message that most K-pop companies send to their artists through the structure of their contracts and their production calendars is that the schedule is the priority and individual welfare is managed around it. JYP's handling of Han's situation in 2022 sent a different message, that a member who needed to step back would be allowed to do so, would be publicly supported in doing so, and would have a place in the group waiting for them when they were ready to return. That is not the industry default. It required the company to absorb the logistical and reputational complexity of a partial roster period and to publicly validate mental health as a reason significant enough to interrupt a commercial schedule. The effect of that institutional decision on Han's creative output after his return is visible. He continued writing, continued producing, continued contributing to Stray Kids' music with the same depth and personal honesty that had characterized his work before. If the company had handled the 2022 period differently, had pushed him through the schedule without the space to recover, or had created an environment where asking for that space felt professionally dangerous, the creative toll on his output would almost certainly have been measurable. JYP's choice to prioritize his recovery over the calendar was also functionally a choice to protect one of the group's most prolific and distinctive creative voices for the long term. Han's lyrical work within Stray Kids' discography addresses themes that most idol group songwriting avoids entirely: the specific anxiety of being watched, the fear of inadequacy, the psychological cost of performance, the conflict between public expectation and private reality. These themes appear across multiple albums, in multiple tracks, with enough consistency and specificity to constitute a genuine creative statement, rather than a one-time departure from an otherwise conventional catalog. JYP's willingness to release that content, to make it the face of what Stray Kids is communicating musically, reflects a company that understood something about what makes this group distinct, and chose to protect it even when the content in question was uncomfortable by mainstream K-pop standards. There is also the matter of the multicultural dimension of Han's background, the time in Malaysia, the time in Australia, which gave him a breadth of cultural reference that feeds directly into the range of emotional and conceptual territory his writing explores. JYP did not ask him to set that background aside. The same company that built Felix's international identity into a central feature of his public profile made a parallel decision with Han. The fullness of who he is, including the complicated parts, is more valuable as creative fuel than it would be as a managed professional liability. What JYP gave Han is protection of his mental health when it was under pressure, of his creative authenticity when it would have been easier to direct him towards something safer, and of his place within the group when the industry's standard playbook would have demanded he simply keep up or be left behind. In an industry that regularly sacrifices individuals to maintain commercial schedules, the decision to do the opposite, to protect the person in order to preserve the creative voice, is neither obvious nor common. JYP made it consistently and documentably with Han. The music that has resulted from that protection is the evidence. It is still being made.
Number 2, the final piece JYP saved for last, IN. Every group has a structure, and in K-pop, that structure is almost always visible in how the debut lineup is assembled and announced. The sequence in which members are confirmed, the way the group takes its final shape, the moment when the last piece is placed, these are production decisions that the label controls entirely, and they communicate something about how the label thinks about each individual within the group's architecture. Young Jung-in, born February 8, 2001 in Busan, South Korea, is the youngest member of Stray Kids. He was also the last member confirmed for the group's debut lineup. That is not a coincidence, and it is not simply a function of his age. JYP made a deliberate structural decision to hold his confirmation for the final position, to build the entire visible narrative of the group's formation toward the moment when Jung-in, operating under the stage name IN, became the member who completed what Stray Kids would be. Understanding that decision requires understanding what it means to debut the youngest person in the room, and what JYP was actually saying about his value when they chose to make his inclusion the culminating moment of the group's public assembly. The Mnet reality program Stray Kids aired in 2017 and served as the mechanism through which JYP assembled the group's final debut roster. The show's structure was elimination-based, with members competing and being evaluated across episodes. The final confirmed lineup was revealed through the program's conclusion, and the sequence of that revelation was shaped by production decisions that JYP had control over. Jung-in's confirmation as the final member, the last person whose place in the group was publicly established, was not a default outcome of him simply being the last one standing. It was a presentation choice. JYP chose to close the formation of Stray Kids with the youngest member in the room, which communicates a specific kind of institutional confidence, that the person they believed completed this group was 17 years old, was still years away from reaching the peak of his artistic development, and was worth betting the final position on precisely because of what he was going to become rather than what he had already demonstrated. Debuting at 17 in a major K-pop group under a Big Four label is not a small thing. It means entering a professional environment with schedules, media appearances, international touring, commercial obligations, and public scrutiny that most adults find demanding, at an age when the majority of JYP's own trainees are still years away from being considered for debut. The company's decision to include Jung-in in the Stray Kids lineup at that age reflects a calculation that his current ability, plus his developmental trajectory, was worth more to the group's long-term identity than waiting for him to reach a more fully formed professional stage. That is a specific kind of institutional trust, one that says we are not only assessing what you can do right now, we are assessing who you are going to be, and we believe that person belongs in this group from the beginning, rather than waiting until the evidence is more conclusive. The privilege embedded in that decision extends across the entire arc of IN's career with Stray Kids. Because JYP chose to debut him young rather than wait, he has had years of professional development inside an active, touring, recording group, accumulating experience that simply cannot be replicated in a training room. The growth that has been publicly visible in his vocal performance, his stage presence, and his overall command as a performer between the group's 2018 debut and their subsequent years of activity is substantial. That growth happened in real conditions, on real stages, in front of real audiences, and it was made possible by JYP's initial decision to put him in those conditions rather than keep him in preparation indefinitely. The company invested in his development by giving him the highest stakes learning environment available, an actual debut in an actual group with actual commercial expectations attached. JYP's management of IN within the group structure has consistently reflected an awareness of what it means to be the youngest person in a professional environment that places intense demands on its members. The protective dimension of the K-pop maknae dynamic, the youngest member receiving a degree of care and consideration from older members and from the company's management structure, is real in Stray Kids' case in ways that are publicly visible. But beyond the interpersonal dimension, JYP's institutional approach to IN has involved allowing him the space to develop on a timeline that respects his actual age, rather than forcing premature artistic maturity because the group's commercial schedule demands it. This is not something that every K-pop label manages successfully with young members. The industry has documented cases where young idols were placed under pressures that their developmental stage was not equipped to handle, with consequences that became visible later. JYP's track record with IN reflects a more calibrated approach. As the group's career has progressed, IN's role within Stray Kids' creative output has expanded alongside his development as an artist. His vocal contributions have become more prominent, his individual identity more defined, and his participation in the group's content more distinctive. The trajectory is exactly what JYP was betting on when they made the decision to debut him at 17, that the person standing in the room at that age would, given time and the right conditions, grow into something that validated the early bet. The verifiable record of his development across Stray Kids' discography and live performances is the evidence that the bet was sound. There's also the matter of what JYP communicated to IN himself through the decision to confirm him last. Being the last member, the person whose inclusion is presented as the completion of the group, carries a specific psychological weight. It is not the same as being one of the first members confirmed, whose position is established early and then watches the rest of the group assemble around them. Being the last means being the person the group was waiting to be complete. For a 17-year-old from Busan entering one of the most competitive professional environments in the Korean music industry, that framing matters. JYP did not present Jung-in's inclusion as a tentative experiment or a calculated risk being taken on a young trainee. They presented it as the moment Stray Kids became what it was supposed to be. That institutional statement about his place in the group's identity is something that no subsequent award or commercial milestone can fully replicate, because it happened before any of those outcomes were known, when the only basis for the statement was JYP's own conviction about who Jung-in was and what he was going to contribute. The youngest person in the room was also the last confirmation the group needed. JYP made both of those facts true simultaneously, deliberately, and on camera. In an industry where youth is often treated as a liability to be managed rather than a trajectory to be invested in, that decision reads differently. It reads as a company that understood something about potential that box scores cannot capture, and chose to build their final lineup around it.
Number 1. The investment that took 7 years to pay off. Bangchan. Every number 1 on a list like this should be the entry that makes everything before it make sense in retrospect. The privileges documented across the previous 7 members, the reinstated debut position, the fast-tracked training period, the protected hiatuses, the creative freedoms, the identity preservation, all of those individual decisions exist within a framework that JYP built. And the person around whom that framework was constructed, the member whose specific skill set, temperament, and vision shaped what Stray Kids could be before a single album was released, is Christopher Bong, born October 3, 1997, in Sydney, Australia, known professionally as Bangchan. What JYP gave Bangchan is not one privilege. It is the sum total of a decision that was made approximately 7 years before Stray Kids debuted. A decision to invest in a single person at the age of roughly 13, to maintain that investment through nearly a decade of training, and then to hand that person the creative and organizational keys to an entire group. The scale of that institutional commitment, measured in time, in resources, and in structural authority given to one artist, is without precedent in JYP Entertainment's documented history with any act at a comparable career stage. Bangchan joined JYP Entertainment as a trainee around 2010 at approximately 13 years of age, having moved from Sydney, Australia to Seoul to pursue music professionally. He trained under JYP for approximately 7 to 8 years before debuting with Stray Kids in March 2018. In the Kpop trainee system, the average training period before debut is 2 to 7 years, and most trainees who reach the 7-year mark without debuting are either left the company or been quietly deprioritized in favor of newer recruits. Bangchan's 7-year training period at JYP did not reflect the company's uncertainty about him. It reflected, paradoxically, the opposite, a company that was holding its longest-serving active trainee in reserve because they had a specific plan for what he was going to be used for, and that plan required the right conditions and the right group of people around him before it could be activated. During those 7 years, Bangchan did not sit idle. He developed as a vocalist, as a dancer, as a producer, and as a leader, and he worked within the JYP system in ways that made his abilities visible to the company's leadership over an extended period. He served as a backup dancer for JYP X during live broadcast performances, a documented role that placed him in professional performance conditions while he was still a trainee, building the kind of real stage experience that accelerates development in ways that practice rooms cannot replicate. When JYP launched the Stray Kids reality program in 2017, the company placed Bongchan in the position of leader from the beginning. This was not a ceremonial designation. In K-pop groups, the leader title sometimes functions as a public-facing role without substantive authority over the group's creative direction. JYP's implementation of the leadership role in Stray Kids was structurally different. Bongchan was positioned as the group's head producer, the person with actual, functional creative authority over the music the group would make from before the debut through the trainee competition period and into every album cycle that followed. His production credits span virtually the entirety of Stray Kids' discography. The 3-Racha unit, which he leads alongside Changbin and Han, functions as the group's in-house production engine, and Bongchan's role within that unit as the primary architect of the group's sonic direction is documented through production credits, in interviews, and in the observable consistency of the group's sound across multiple album cycles. JYP did not hire an external production team to make Stray Kids music and then hand it to the members to perform. They built the group around a production capability that was already inside the room, centered on the person they had been training for 7 years, and let that capability drive the creative output. The commercial results of that decision, a group that generates genuine creative ownership of their catalog, and the audience loyalty that ownership produces, are verifiable across Stray Kids' sales figures, streaming numbers, and award record. Then there is Chan's Room. Bongchan has been running a consistent, independent live stream series, originally through VLive, subsequently through Weverse, for years. The format is deliberately unscripted and personal. He connects with fans late at night, plays music including non-Stray Kids tracks and Western music spanning multiple genres, discusses whatever is on his mind, and creates a sustained, direct line of communication with the global fanbase that operates entirely outside the structured promotional framework of label-managed content. Chan's Room has been running with a consistency and frequency that is documented and publicly verifiable, and it represents something that requires explicit company approval to execute. JYP allowing Chan to broadcast independently, regularly on his own terms, playing music from any source and speaking candidly about his thoughts and experiences, means the company made a deliberate decision to give him an unmanaged public channel, one that reaches millions of people and is not scripted, not pre-approved on a content basis, and not filtered through a marketing strategy. That level of communicative freedom is genuinely extraordinary for an artist under contract with a major entertainment company. The rationale is visible in what Chan's Room produces, a fanbase connection so deep and so consistently maintained that it has become one of the defining features of how Stray Kids relates to its global audience. JYP recognized that Chan's instinct for that kind of authentic communication was more valuable operating freely than it would be operating inside a controlled content framework. The combination of what JYP gave Chan, the 7-year investment, the actual creative authority rather than a ceremonial leadership title, the production infrastructure built around his specific capabilities, and the freedom to communicate directly and independently with the global fanbase, represents the most comprehensive set of privileges extended to any single member, because it is not a set of individual decisions made at different points.
It is a coherent, sustained institutional strategy that JYP built around one person's specific combination of abilities and committed to over nearly a decade before it produced a single commercially released product. The company looked at a 13-year-old from Sydney, decided he was worth a 7-year investment, built an entire group's operational framework around what he was going to be able to do when that investment matured, and then gave him the structural authority to actually execute on the vision, rather than handing it off to senior producers to deliver on his behalf. Most K-pop leaders operate within the framework their company builds for the group. Bangchan operates within a framework JYP built around him. That is not the same thing, and the distance between those two positions is the distance between a role and an architecture. 7 years of training, head producer credit on the majority of the group's catalog, a weekly unscripted independent broadcast channel with a global audience, creative authority that extends from pre-debut to the present. JYP did not give Bangchan a seat at the table. They built the table for him, waited 7 years for him to be ready to sit at it, and then handed him the room. That is the most significant privilege on this list, not because it is the most dramatic, but because it is the one that made all the others possible.